There's a lot of information in your program about the panel, but let me lift up a couple highlights. Peg Reagan is Jimmy's mom. She is also the mother of 5 children. In addition, 5 counting Jimmy, right? Okay, we didn't want to add one. And all of them live very vibrant and creative lives. But in a very particular way, Peg has been artful and creative in how she has called out and nurtured Jimmy's life as an artist. And in my mind, that is about being an artist. And Jan Cather Weaver is Professor Emerita of Theology and the Arts at United. Every time she teaches the theological interpretation of the arts class, one of the sessions is on outsider arts. And so we're very excited that she can bring her lens to today. And Jeff Anderson, who's been Jimmy's mentor for the last few years. He is a MFA in sculpture, and he's been very key in the conversation with Jimmy. And Jimmy, we are so honored to have Jimmy's art here. This art is sacred in all sorts of ways. We find joy, inspiration, solace, a hope, insight in colors and shapes and textures. And we are grateful for the ways in which his art communicates even without words. So I'm going to turn it over to the panel. There'll be a little opportunity to hear from each one of them, and then maybe a little opportunity for questions. Thank you and welcome.
I'm Peg Schneeman Reagan, and as Cindy Beth said, I'm Jimmy's mom. I guess I'm his vocal representative. I think I'll answer or talk about questions that people ask me, and one is, has Jimmy created art his whole life? The answer is no. There are 100 years of artists in my family, but Jimmy was not an apparent artist to me as a young man. He's 24 years old, was diagnosed with complex autism when he was 2.5, and has had a lot of healthcare struggles. And in 2008, he was so sick that he was unable to be in school. So we took him out of school and had a tutor that came to our house. And my husband had a position where he traveled quite frequently. And if you have 5 children who are 5.5 years apart in age from oldest to youngest, and it's January in Minnesota, you do projects at the kitchen table. And I happened to mention to this tutor that I said, you know what, it just kind of dawned on me that Jim will sit with us at the kitchen table and do art projects. It's nonverbal, right? And I always told the doctor when he was younger, it was like I can show him how to do something, I can't tell him. And I can show him and he'll do it right 100% of the time. And if I tell him, he just is really having a hard time with that. And so this tutor said, well, why don't we try geography through art? We'll get a t-shirt and we'll draw the state of Minnesota on it, and we can put all his favorite places. Grandma's house in Park Rapids, great grandma's house in New Ulm, and he kind of was into it. And so this idea of trying to teach him visually, she then said to me, I have a friend who is quite interested in people in the spectrum, and she's an art teacher. Would you mind if she came over and tried to do some things with Jim? And I said, sure. I mean, he was at a point where he was 14 years old, 62 pounds, couldn't complete one task after the next, except this art was seeming to speak to him. So this woman shows up, and she has a small notepad with lines on it, and she has a pencil. And she said, she drew a little doodle, and she handed it to Jim, and she said, Jim, draw me a doodle. And he looked at her and handed her back the pencil and the pad and was out of there. And Jim is, when I tell people about Jim, I say he's more like a stroke patient in that he knows and understands everything that is around him. He can ski, he's physically able to do all kinds of things. He cannot get the words out. So sometimes you imagine the frustration of someone that knows what it is that they want to do, but they can't articulate it. So Jim also learned how to read at a very early age and knew his letters and numbers very early. And this woman who was coming to our home, who was the art teacher, understood and knew that Jim knew how to read and knew letters and numbers. So she said, well, I'm going to come back in a couple of weeks and with some other ideas. So she shows up, and she has images, art images that have letters and numbers in it. And she said, Jim, if you put 6s together, it can be like fringe on an awning. If you put 7s on top of each other, it can be scales on a fish or a roof. And he kind of looked at this like, that is kind of cool. And clearly piqued his interest. About the same time, we were identifying what the healthcare problems were, and he was starting to feel better, and he was more able to complete 2 or 3 tasks. So we decided that we said, well, why don't you try and draw page 22 out of National Geographic, and then you can do this. And then, so we were using kind of the art as the motivator. And suddenly he was drawing page 22, page 27, page 28, and we're all like, he's doing something independently. This is really exciting. That was our first thought. Then the second thought was, this is really interesting. His perspective of what he is drawing out of this magazine is totally different. He's seeing something totally different than I was seeing when I was looking at it. So we kind of started to move along and introduced oil pastels, and then he's blending the pastels, and all of a sudden I'm thinking, this is really unique. And he's using what he calls tick marks. So these short lines that you see, he's named those tick marks. And in his early pieces, the whole faces were tick marks. And it was really interesting. So I frame your kids' artwork, don't you? I mean, I do. And I thought, well, this is really interesting. And we were involved in a project at the University of Minnesota. My husband and I were co-founders of the Autism Clinic, and Jim was their first patient in 2000. And as a thank you to his doctors that were treating him at the time, and then we were also involved in some fundraising there, I made note cards for the doctors. We have one of his docs is here in the audience, and I thought, well, this will just be a nice thank you. And we had an event at our house where they came, and we were able to give them the gifts. And they said, who's the artist? And I said, it's Jim. We had one of the docs says, no, it's not. And I said, well, yes, it is. And she said, her response was, we have no idea what's going on. We know so little about Jim, and I can see that in this artwork. And what was really interesting, because he's significantly language impaired and has had a history of a lot of behavioral issues, most people, not knowing him, would treat him as though he was a badly behaving 3 or 4-year-old. And he knew that, and felt that. And the art completely changed his posture. I'm sure many of you have seen him walking through the hallways, loves to shake hands, and he's very proud of the artwork. And it's developed into, I think he offers people hope about things that they don't know, or maybe express that there's so little we know about how the brain works, and that there's so much potential and things that you don't really expect. And I know that Jim has taught me to be much more open-minded and to try and be a problem solver and all kinds of different things. But so that's sort of the evolution of Jim's art, how it started.
Thank you, Peg. That's a hard act to follow. I've been asked in 7 short minutes to talk about what is outsider art. And I will get into this more deeply, but in the 18th and 19th century, it was identified as art that came from people that were so-called disabled, and they did not fit into society. They were marginalized in institutions because society could not cope with them. That's the way I like to put it, rather than they could not conform to society. It's more the point that society could not cope with them. And that it was called art brut in the beginning, and it means raw art. And it comes from artists who are not trained, and they do not use the training and do not want or do not wish to learn and really have no desire to learn the traditions of the fine art world, the 3D perspective, the color palette, etc. They express their art authentically, but they are not trained to, and it has become such a fashion outsider art that there are finely trained artists now that are trying to paint as though they are outside artists. But you can tell the difference. You really can. And that's it's that rawness that we see in Jimmy's art that makes it so stunning and that compels us to really look and see. And the task of an outsider artist is not to be a professional artist full time. The task is simply to create. And Chelsea put up on the PowerPoint a quote that I had written that I needed to take down because I couldn't remember it, that an outside artist is absent of intention and expectations, and they are propelled sheerly by their creative impulse to express a view of the moment of their reality. They are not compelled by society, by their family, by their peers, by fine art movements, by museums, by making money. They are sheerly compelled by the creative impulse. It's something to be admired. And this is an example of another outside artist that I worked with, Gary Seal, who has since died. And he is the brother of Dean Seal, if any of you know Dean Seal, in the Minneapolis community. And he works with abstract, but again, you will see the bright, bold colors. And when Dean asked Gary, what is the title of this painting? Oops. What is the title of this painting? Gary said, Jesus. And so when I present this in my classes, people are going, where's Jesus? Where's Jesus? Is that dark mark Jesus? They're looking for a representation of Jesus, rather than understanding that this is an expression of an experience. It's a creative impulse experience. And it's that expression of that moment. And this is an example of how Gary works. He does not plan out what he's going to create. He would grab the pastel and he would just begin to draw. There's no intention other than to respond to the creative impulse. And here's another one of his works. Again, he would not title this for me, which is just fine. And this are some of his very last works. And I don't know if this is showing up. So he used a different, yeah, that's it. Okay. I'd like to challenge that we understand, the common understanding of outside artists is that they live in the margins, and that today we have to understand that outside artists live among us. They are our family members, they are in our school, they're in our congregations, they are people who are not necessarily on the margins, they are us. And that part of that is to understand that a theological understanding of what is so-called disability is that an individual does not have a disability, or somebody is not medically diagnosed with a disability, that someone who is so-called labeled diagnosed is not limited, but is differently abled, is uniquely human. The Latin for dis, the prefix means not. So that means they have no abilities. Disability means no ability, not able, as well as apart from ability. So I think we need to think about the word disability and its common parlance in society. But I think we need to understand that we live in a dualistic social construction of so-called ability versus disability. And the reality is that we are all differently abled and uniquely human. And to use the old language, we all have disabilities. But I don't like that language. But, and we have to understand that there is not a norm that we all fit into. We live in a society that would like to force us into a norm, that would like Jimmy to communicate through language. But how does Jimmy communicate best? Exactly. I read a quote in a book that said, "Isn't it absolutely terrible that the deaf do not know how to communicate?" The deaf know how to communicate perfectly well. I don't know how to communicate with a deaf person because I have yet to learn the language. So the question really is that we understand all of ourselves as uniquely and differently abled, and that we are all hands and eyes, and that we need one another to form we have different tasks to form the whole body, to do the work of the community. And the question to ask is that, what is Jimmy saying to us that we would not hear if he did not tell us through his visual language? What is he trying to tell us? I notice, and I have just sampled his work here. He loves the faces of people. And I can only take a stab in the dark and guess that Jimmy communicates through faces rather than words, and is communicating back to us through different faces. But I don't know. But the task really is for us to understand what Jimmy is saying. And he is a so-called in society, according to fine art, an outsider artist, but actually he is a fine, fine artist.
Here's a pastel that's called Face Sick. And this is a really great example. So this is about 3 years ago. He has a condition where his health care kind of goes like this. And we knew he wasn't feeling well. And he'd done this pastel of a face. And we have all of his artwork professionally scanned for reproduction, note cards and various other things. And so I said to him, I said, "Jim, do you want to sign these pastels so I can take them and get them scanned?" And so he just kind of looked at me and took this pastel of this face, and I watch him, and he signs his name in kind of the background is an emerald green oil pastel. And he takes kind of a light orange pastel, and he signs his name upside down and backwards. I know the orientation of this piece, saw him create it, and I looked at him and I said, "Jim," I said, "what are you doing? Your name is upside down and backwards." And he took the emerald green pastel went over his name again, got a dark blue, and signed it down upside down and backwards. And I said, "What is going on?" He looked at me sick. And I said, "You feel upside down and backwards." And he said, "Yes." And 2 weeks later, we had him scoped and found he had all kinds of, he felt awful. And it took him to sign his name upside down and backwards for me to get it. And when we thought about it, he'd been trying to communicate it, and I just thought, oh, he must have just thought, well, the only way she's going to get it is if I sign my name upside down and backwards. And we did, but that really alerted me in a different way to think about how, what is he trying to say to us. So.
Exactly.
Yeah, speak his language.
I met Jimmy and his family about 2.5 years ago. My brother-in-law, Mark Olson, works at the University of Minnesota with a department that works with disadvantaged, differently abled. And actually, that's somewhat a new concept or new term, actually. And they would, I think every quarter they would have an art show of people that have disabilities, and they would bring them in. And Mark told me about Jimmy and wanted me to come and see his work. And so I got to meet Jimmy. I got to meet his mom and dad and his family. And there was a piece there that I just loved because it was of, I come to find out, a wire chicken in their backyard. But it was this drawing he did of this chicken, and they had replicated it 3 times. And then Jimmy went in there and he used some oil pastels and put color in there. And it reminded me of when I taught at the college level in design classes that there was some design where we'd have the student draw their face, and then they would use different kinds of color theory to draw in, use the color to draw the color theory. And I just mentioned to my brother-in-law how much I loved that piece, and he ended up buying it for me for Christmas. But I also heard Peg talk about many of the things she just said tonight about this person coming in and working with Jimmy. And I don't know why, but in the back of my head, and I did say this to Mark, I said, I want to be that person. And when you say something to Mark, it's going to get back to Peg, and next thing I know, I'm working with them. And it's just been a blast. I know we talked a little bit about outsider art, and I was a little concerned, and I talked to Peg about this, is that I didn't want to come in and give Jimmy a college level course and change him. But we talked about it a little bit, and it was like, well, let's, give him some information. So what I did is I started off with this kind of a design course with Jim. We talked about focal points and unity with variety and all the things that we would deal with art. And Jim understood it, but the difference with Jim and the students that I've taught in college is that I would have them do the work, and then we would have a critique, and we would talk back and forth about why they did it. You can't do that with Jim. So I learned through Thomas, that his assistant, that you pretty much have to kind of do more of a closed-ended, open-ended questions, where it's a yes or no, or point to something and it's this or that with him. So I think while he got it, I just don't think that he was really enjoying it as much as I really wanted him to. He was learning, but just I'd come over and it was okay. And you have to understand Jim we have these art classes that he likes to have the TV on, and he can only focus on one thing at a time, and if he's not liking what he's doing, he wants to run over the TV, and we'd have to end up flicking the switches on the circuit breaker to turn off all the TVs in the house so that he wouldn't run from room to room to look at all the TVs going on. So I just kind of came to the conclusion that what we were doing, while it was things that were important for him, I don't think it was working in the direction I wanted to go. So we had to switch gears a little bit. So we started experimenting a little bit. And I know in talking to Peg, Jim does a lot of 2D work, but I have a background in sculpture. So we thought, let's try a few other things here. So what we started working on is something called Fimo clay. I don't know if you've ever seen this, just little packets of clay that you can actually bake in your refrigerator, bake it in your oven. So we started a bunch of things with that, and we started doing, Jim was really into masks and animals. There's one piece back over there that was a self-portrait of his. So we started to have a little bit of fun with that. And what I wanted to show him too was that everything in art doesn't have to be paint on a canvas. So we started working with other things too. We started working with cardboard. I mean, who works in cardboard? Picasso worked in cardboard. Why not? So, we started doing a little bit of that kind of thing. And I also started to do some things where you kind of copy some of his work that he'd already done so that there was a little bit of comfort level in doing it. And one of the other things that Jim does, which is not unusual for somebody with autism, is that he likes to watch movies, and he'll repeat movie lines over and over and over, Harry Potter especially. I haven't seen Harry Potter, but I think I know the whole movie now. And in working with Jim, at one point I could kind of tell things weren't going great because it wasn't great movie lines I was getting, but as time went on, we started to get better movie lines, and it was a lot more fun. And one of my favorite stories with Jim is all of a sudden I was over there one day and he started speaking Spanish to me. And I'm going, what's going on? Well, apparently he was watching The Good, the Bad, and the Ugly or something like that, and it got stuck in the SAP, Spanish channel, so he'd watch it over and over and over. So all of a sudden he's speaking Spanish to me, and I just got a kick out of that. But some of the things that I learned with Jim is, and a lot of artists are this way, is that it isn't necessarily the finished piece of art that it is. It's about process. It's about actually doing the work. And when we started working with some of the female clay, there were certain things that we were trying to do, and there were times when all of a sudden he'd kind of go off on a tangent and he would just start cutting the female clay into little pieces and then smaller pieces and smaller pieces. Because what we're going to do is we're going to do those tick marks that he likes to do with his paint. But we're going to use the clay to try to do that. But he didn't want anything to do with it. He just wanted to keep on, cutting that clay smaller and smaller and smaller. So I picked up on that, and we ended up doing a piece that we call the Jenga piece, where I was able to get some different pieces of wood, objects, various things, and I cut them up into these pieces, drilled a hole, and then had this metal rod, and then you would just kind of put them on top of each other, and it kind of made this totem pole kind of thing, if you will. And then Jim was going to do then was going to go ahead and he was going to paint all those pieces, and then we were going to go ahead and allow him to then put them in, take them out, put them in. It was going to be about process. And I think he did that for a while. I'm not sure if he uses that piece much anymore, but we had a lot of fun with that. But again, it was about the process too. One of the mediums, and you'll see a few of them out there that we kind of came across, and it was for a reason, is foam. We worked in some foam core. I don't know if you know what foam core is, but we made this dog out of foam core that was kind of fun. We did a few things out of the cardboard, which worked really well. But then I came up with this foam, and because you can get a sheet of foam, and it's this blue or pink foam, depending on which kind you get. And then what I was going to have him do is draw on it, and then he was going to kind of carve into it. And Jim loves power tools. I tell you can see a picture of him with a power tool, the biggest smile in the world. And so we would do some things with the foam with the power tools, but I just didn't want to get their house dirty, So we ended up doing things with, cutting and doing some things in the garage with it too. But this is kind of where processes happened, where we started off doing this, and what he would do was a drawing, and then he would cut grooves in there, and then we would go ahead and have him paint. Or he would then he started doing this on himself, but he'd start painting it, and then he would cut the grooves in later. And there might be a piece or two out there that are like that. But when Thomas and I were doing this with him, one day I kind of mentioned how when I was in college, there was somebody that had been doing some woodcuts. And I said, this really is kind of not all that far different from the woodcuts. I said, why don't we try doing a print? So we did that, and we would take, he would do his cutting, and then we would turn it over, print it, and then, the big thing was the big reveal, and then he'd pull it up, and there'd be something new on there, and then he would put some more paint on there. We would do a little bit more. And so I think we got some really, really interesting and nice pieces out of that, which I think is going to be our winter project, because I don't want to mess their house up again. Some of the things that we do is we kind of come up with an idea for Jim, a project, if you will. We'll pick the medium, and when I say we, I pick the medium and I picked an idea for him. And then it's really up to him what he does with it. But the things that are so interesting is that I think in my mind, this is what this is going to turn out to look like. And it never turns that way. Which I think is a great thing, because, when I was teaching students, it's like, okay, all the students, you have to do this and it's going to all look like this. Well, that's not what ends up happening. And when you're working with Jim and you say, Jim, do this, what happens? He doesn't do it. No. Some of the things that I really learned with working with Jim is that when I was in graduate school, we were kind of taught that this is the way it was to be done, or you had to think it through, and everything you did, there had to be a reason for it. You'd have these critiques, and you had to go in there, and you had to, any little mark on that paper or wherever, there had to be a reason for it. And I learned through Jim that that isn't the case. Sometimes you just go ahead and go. And in my work, I had this thing what we call paralysis analysis, where I don't do things just because I think it, and think it, and think it, and it doesn't get done because of that. And working with Jim, you go over there and say, well, you're going to work with Jim. He starts doing things. And things that he comes up are just incredible. So it has just been a pleasure. I spend about an hour a week with him, most every week. And I look forward to going over there. And I think after a certain point, I think Jimmy's really started to look forward to getting together and doing that. And as you can see, not all of this work is the stuff that he and I have done, but you can see how prolific he is with doing work. And I just love doing it. How was the critique? Well, it's just different because with my other students, again, you teach them to do something and you have a conversation with them and say, why did you do that? And you can tell, I mean, I can give you a D or I can give you an A, and part of it is because of this wonderful piece of work you got there, but you really have to be able to tell me why you did it. With Jim, it doesn't work that way necessarily. So again, it's kind of, when we started talking about design principles and all that, at the beginning I would ask him about this or that, and he would point. I say, well, Jim, where's the balance? And he would kind of do this kind of, point and all that kind of stuff. So it's a little bit of a challenge to do that. So it's gotten to the point where I don't really critique, well, we don't critique the work with him at all. I mean, it's just like, Jim, here it is, go at it, and let's see what happens.
Does he study? So when we decided when he, with his tutor, that we actually changed his entire curriculum to be around art. So he would read about artists. He goes to the Minneapolis Institute of Arts once a week. He goes to the Weissman. So we expose him to as many artists as we can. Sometimes people call us and say, hey, I saw this. Maybe Jim might be interested in it. We show it to him because you can see the influence. His very early pieces, there were a lot of tick marks and white because it was all on paper. And he went to the Minneapolis Institute of Arts and saw his first real Van Gogh, and it was the olive trees. Mm-hmm. And he went up to the side of the wall like this. Mm-hmm. And was looking at the depth of the painting. When he came back, no more white on the paper. Everything was completely covered. We took him to the Chicago Institute a number of years ago, and we went there on a mission to see a Van Gogh, which of course was not there because it had gone on the road like the week before we got there. And I thought, oh my gosh, we've come all the way here, and I promised him it's not here. And we went into the mid-century wing, and it was like his eyes opened up. His color palette totally changed. And so we can see when he is introduced to something how it impacts what he does. I think he's here right now, and I think he wants to, Jim, you ready? He has a quick little thing.
Thank you for supporting our art.
Can you say it real loud though? In the microphone.
Thank you for supporting my art.
It's kind of all happened by accident. The one thing I will say is that I've always been a believer that when things are a challenge, doors open, and you have a choice of whether or not you're going to walk through the door. And sometimes, the life with Jim is about which doors you're going to go through, because there are a lot of them that close, and so you have to look for other opportunities. Things have happened with Jim that are always surprising. I say we have these guardian angels that are kind of around us when things are really challenging for him, and I think and pray hard about, what am I going to do next? How is this going to evolve? I mean, when he was pulled out of school in 2008, I have 5 children, and now I'm homebound. We didn't have staff for him, and at this point it's like I can't go to the grocery store. I mean, this was a kid who couldn't leave the house for 2.5 years because we couldn't take him out of the house safely. And so, the evolution of the artwork, it really brought him into, a different place. And when I say by accident, we made note cards as a thank you note, and the next thing we knew, we were asked where can people buy the note cards, and then when are you going to have an opening, and followed by, okay, well, maybe we'll try and do an opening along with this event for the University of Minnesota Department of Pediatrics called Wine Fest. And so we hold an opening where we probably have 50 pastels, no paintings, 50 pastels. We invite a group of people, 250 people show up. We sold everything I had. And I just thought, I cannot believe this. And, it just sort of evolved, he was asked to do a painting in 2011 to donate a barrel top for the University of Minnesota Wine Fest. And I thought, okay, he's never done a painting. I don't know what to do with paint. How are we going to do this? I said yes before I had any idea how he could do a painting that they wanted for a silent auction. And we did a lot of kind of practicing, and how could we help him have this happen? What kind of paint do we use? How can we anyway, worked out okay. Then he was asked to be their featured artist. Then my brother-in-law said, you guys need a website. You should be selling your note cards. And so he helped me build a website. We created an online presence. The next thing I know, I have an email from a gallery in Berlin. We'd seen his stuff, apply for this show. We applied, he gets in. I'm shipping 2 paintings off to Berlin. I'm thinking, how the heck? Things have evolved that way. Same type of thing happened with, he was in Art Expo Milano for 3 months. He had 2 paintings that were there for 3 months. They took one of the paintings up to another event in Lugano. We actually had the opportunity to go over. Jimmy does not fly, but we went on his behalf. And 120 artists from all around the world. And little Jimmy Reagan. So we do put his artwork out there. It speaks to people. We try to have done a lot of good and been thankful to all the organizations that have supported him. 2 weeks ago, we were in LA. He had a painting that was the featured artwork for the Purpose Awards, which are part of the Streamies. And the Streamies are the internet influencers, so YouTube artists and the social media artists. It's their big, like Grammys, and his painting was the featured artwork. You know, so we've helped get his artwork out there. We try and support him as much as we can, and he's prolific. So, you know, we have tons and tons of artwork that is very uninteresting. We have a lot of peanuts. He loves the peanuts, and so we have a lot of Charles Schultz pieces, I guess, around. But it's, you know, it has been a journey. It's always shocking to me, and it's shocking that it's all kind of taken place in such a short period of time. He's going to have 4 or 5 paintings that are going to be in the LA Art Show in January, just 70,000 people in 4 days. He had a painting that was at Art Expo Chicago in 2012, and Northern Trust featured him as, they're the sponsor of the event, and his painting was featured in the VIP lounge. So his artwork speaks to people, the color speaks to people. They often say, I have no idea why I like it, I'm just drawn to it. And I think that speaks to the, you know, Jimmy's going to do what he's going to do, and he's not restricted by what other people say. And in some of his pieces that aren't here, the signature is in an eyeball, or the signature is on the neck, or the signature is hidden someplace, or it doesn't have to be in the lower right-hand corner. A number of years ago at one of his events, a woman came up to me and she said, my daughter was a studio art major, and she signed her painting like in the upper left-hand corner. And the art professor came up and said, you can't do that. It has to be in the lower right-hand corner. And he physically went over her signature and told her she had to re-sign it. Well, she quit art school. And she told her mother, she said, that can't be right. And she said, I don't want to be a part of that if this is what it is. And so I think, Jim, there's a freedom about his autism diagnosis, I think, that he doesn't really care what it's supposed to be. He does what he wants it to be. And I think for a lot of artists, the analysis paralysis happens because they're worried about what somebody else is going to say about their artwork. That is not Jim. He's his own critic. And if he doesn't like something, he just, you know, he doesn't like it. But he doesn't really, he appreciates that you love his artwork, and he gets great joy out of that. But he doesn't really care if you don't like it. He cares if you do like it, but he doesn't really care if you don't. So I think that there's a real freedom about that for him. So.